Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're very welcome to the Centre Culturel Irlandais and to this evening's conversation, which marks 20 years to the day since the signing of the Good Friday peace agreement. So, momentous occasion in the history of Northern Ireland. And before I introduce, I firstly introduce our chair for this evening, Declan Long, who, just behind me, who yesterday gave a superb presentation on his recently published book, Ghost Haunted Land, which is about contemporary art, post-Troubles in Northern Ireland. So Declan will be chairing the conversation, who will be assisted in part by Emmanuel Tellier, a grand rapporteur. And I suppose I wanted just to thank Emmanuel, because really the idea for this conversation came about as a result of a conversation that Emmanuel and I had with Rosetta Beaujean. Emmanuel was very keen to I suppose, highlight this complex issue that is the border and the implications of Brexit, and wished to travel to Northern Ireland. Had already met a number of Northern Irish artists here in the centre, including Rita Duffy. And so together we planned the visit, and this resulted in two superb articles. One which was just published actually today. So before I hand over to Declan Long, who will introduce the speakers, I'd like you to welcome the ambassador, the Irish ambassador to France, Patricia O'Brien. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nora. Few words in Irish, forgive me, for those who are good speakers. Aduine Ushla is more on toner avansha, is our on tabakak eisha deren inu. Mesdames et messieurs, c'est un vrai honneur d'être ici parmi vous et de pouvoir discuter d'un sujet brûlant en Irlande actuellement. C'est une excellente idée d'associer un sujet politique de la plus haute importance pour l'Irlande à l'orientation artistique, créative, qui est la spécialité du Centre culturel irlandais. Nous avons un panel impressionnant, représente différentes spécialités artistiques, de perspectives différentes, et deux modérateurs qui le rapporteront clairement et en détail. So today, as Nora says, we're celebrating the Good Friday Agreement. I struck lucky on Sunday morning to turn on Andrew Marr to see my colleague in London, the Irish ambassador, some of you may have seen, discussing where we're at, and in particular, the momentous occasion that Nora has referred to, 20 years of the Good Friday Agreement. And what struck me about what he said, he's a friend and colleague, was that he said straight off the bat, this is not necessarily really a commemoration, but it's a moment where we need to take the opportunity to reaffirm the indispensability of the Good Friday Agreement and all that it represents. The principles and commitments that were undertaken in 1998 are as relevant today as they were then. And that is something that I have no doubt in this room everybody will be very sensitive to. But it is something that we find in the embassy in Paris. We need to communicate on a daily basis to our wonderfully close and cooperative French colleagues, but we see that as a prime responsibility that we have in the embassy at this moment. So not to talk about politics, because we're here to talk about art, but in particular in the context of the border. There is undoubtedly a very special quality to the border. From the widest geographical view, through the closer lenses of politics, communities, and right down to towns, farms, and individuals, the same themes arise again and again, being influenced from above and influencing from below. At all levels, the border represents a defining feature in how we define ourselves, in how we define our counties, in how we define our countries, and soon in how we define the European Union. And at the same time, the border represents a partnership. We have friends and family in Belfast and Dublin. We have farms which cross the border, businesses which depend on cross-border competition, a unified rugby team, a common travel area, and a shared commitment to universal rights and values, not least as defined by our joint membership of the United Nations. This dual-natured border, both a boundary and a pathway to cooperation, is uniquely Irish. The artist can perhaps handle this duality in a way that others cannot. The artist perhaps thrives on this. In my experience, art can encompass complexity and make it easier to understand. But also, in my own experience, it can make us appreciate the complexity of what is seemingly very simple. As such, it is appropriate to turn to the artist for fresh perspectives on the border and also perhaps a vision for how it should be and how it will be in the future. Thank you very much indeed. Merci beaucoup.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the ambassador for her words of introduction and support and interest. I will say very little this evening, except really to perhaps introduce and later respond to our panel this evening. I will say perhaps one thing which follows on from what the ambassador has already opened up for us, which is that we're talking tonight on the anniversary of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, which was, of course, a momentous achievement, which is being celebrated and recognized in all kinds of ways, with speeches and articles reflecting on its meaning and legacy. And we're talking about that today, but we're also talking about how precarious that legacy is, and the difficult position that we're in right now with regard to the border, with regard to the potential renewed meaning and manner of that border. Our panel tonight are going to reflect perhaps on both of these things to some extent. Mainly, we're talking about the border itself. We're talking about perceptions of that border, but we're doing so in the context of this commemorative and questioning moment with regard to the Good Friday Agreement. So to tell you who is on the panel, to my left, by the way, I should say I'm not going to give elaborate introductions. I'm really just going to tell you who's there, because what they're going to do is talk a little about themselves, the work they do, the approach they have to the issues that we're focusing on this evening. To my left, I have Maria McManus, and beside Maria, I should say, first of all, is a poet, and we'll talk about her writing practice. We have Peter Wilson, aka Duke Special, who is a songwriter who will be performing here on Thursday night. To the left of Peter, and we have Emmanuel Tellier, who's been also partly introduced by Nora. Emmanuel has interviewed some of our panel already, as he's been researching into the Irish border and life around the Irish border and responses to that border. And then to Emmanuel's left, we have the artist Rita Duffy, and the artist John Byrne, and both will give an insight shortly into their work. There'll be time at the end, I think, for some conversation. First of all, perhaps between the panel, but certainly involving all of you in the room. As most of the panel are people who are based in Ireland, we may end up talking quickly to ourselves. So please, wave furiously or swear at us or whatever it takes to get us to slow down and be able to communicate carefully to all of you in the room. So
I will make sure that doesn't happen.
Okay.
With my very bad French accent, I will say, please slow down.
Maybe we'll all just start putting on very bad French accents. Maybe that. Okay, but so thank you all for coming, and we will begin, I think, with John. Okay, so each person will talk for a few minutes, and then we'll move on, and there'll be a chance for questions at the end. So, okay, John Byrne.
Bonjour. My name's John, and I'm an artist, and I think I'm here primarily because of a piece of work I did on the border itself back in the year 2000. And if you look at the map behind me, that's the Irish border. I'm actually from Belfast, but I live in Dublin, and which is okay. It's okay. So I did a piece of work which was located just here, this little piece going up and down on the main Belfast to Dublin road before the motorway was built. So this is the Irish border. I mean, the Irish border is a very complicated line, and as has been said earlier on, it cuts across people's houses and homes and lands and farmyards, farmland. And one particular piece, if you look in that map, that's what I meant to do. If you see this piece above the Cavan there's what you call the Dromully salient. And this is it in close-up. And it's a little piece of Monaghan being embraced by Fermanagh. And this, the border was established really, and it followed, old, the county lines. But those county lines sometimes were very ancient. And the border between Cavan on the left and Monaghan on the right were actually, tribal lands. On the left it was the Maguires, and on the right was the McMahons. And anyway, this piece of land was obviously the complexities of that relationship between those two tribal lands. And anyway, so the border is very complicated, and I would be worried about the border. And I actually made a piece of work prior to my border interpretive centre, which I did on the main Dublin to Belfast road, and it was called A Border Worrier, because I was, I come from a line of warriors, and so my father here, we were a south-facing family, which was nice because we got the sun, but we didn't worship it. We weren't stupid. We were sophisticated. Actually, we had the fashionable St. Martin de Porres wallpaper. And we had all sorts of things. And looking back, I really appreciate my parents' openness about the border. My father, in the picture here, it was my father who gave me the facts about the border. Looking back, I really appreciate my parents' openness about the border. A lot of adults would have been too embarrassed to talk about it in front of their children, would have left it to the school, or worse, for them to find out from their friends around the street, which can be really dodgy. I remember my father's exact words. He said, "John, the border's complicated, but the border's only natural. And it's only natural that you should have certain feelings about it. And you will have these feelings as you get older. You shouldn't be ashamed of these feelings. It's only natural." And he was right. I did have feelings about the border. And as I grew older and as I became an artist, I got very involved with the border. Actually, so this was the Border Worrier. So I had these slides, and I performed on a stage in the project in Dublin. This was 1997. And these were images that I used as a backdrop. So I actually went up to the border, and I brought bucket loads of the border to a theatre in Dublin, the Project Theatre in Dublin. And I had loads of the border, and I dumped it out towards the end of the Border Worrier. And I had bucket loads of earth, and I had a wheelbarrow full of the border earth, and I dumped it on the stage of a eminent Dublin theatre, just to see how they'd like it. So one of the lines that towards the end of this performance, or this theatrical piece, was that we should tidy up the border. I actually put little plastic flowers in the project along this bank of earth, of border earth that I'd made, and I said we should tidy the border up. It should, now that there was, peace was imminent. I mean, this is just before the Good Friday Agreement. I said we should tidy it up. We should make it more attractive. You know, it could be a big tourist draw. You know, we should build a visitor centre, and we should build an interpretive centre. So that always got a laugh. And so a few years later, in the year 2000, I established my Border Interpretive Centre. And if you look to the right, that's County Armagh in Northern Ireland, and to the left, isn't that right? No, up there is County Louth in the Republic. So my Border Interpretive Centre was just inside the Republic, and that was my Border Interpretive Centre. So I installed myself as director of the border, best job I've ever had. And there was a billboard campaign throughout the country advertising the border as a family day out. And I was a bit younger then, and it was opened and it was twinned, as you can see, with the Korean border, and it livened up the border at night. And I'm just going to play you. I'm just going to play you now. Oh, all right. Wait a minute. Oh, all right.
Thank you very much. John here and his hard-working team have just done a fantastic job to get this place off the ground. And I think it's £9 million, very well spent. And now it gives me great pleasure and pride to declare the Border Interpretive Centre well and truly open. Thank you very much.
I'm going to go.
We're going like hotcakes. We're selling little ceramic watchtowers, good luck from the border. We're selling sticks of rock. We're selling T-shirts. We have actual samples of the genuine border itself for people to take away and look at. You can actually plant it, you know, grow your own border in your back garden. I mean, it won't be like the border itself, but it'll be, you know, it'll give you a taste of what it's all about.
I will be back. Anyway, these are some images that I made around that. You know, I had kind of like souvenir stuff, you know, photographing British Army watchtowers, which would have been, I suppose, like sort of Norman castles of the, you know, castles of Ireland was a big thing. So I did this, you know, castles of the border. And these are British Army installations. And anyway, that's another story.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be at the CCI. Thank you, Nora, and all the staff here who organised everything. I'm an artist and I live on the border. We bought a piece of the border a couple of years before the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, and eventually went to live there. So what I'm going to do is kind of gallop you through some earlier projects in order to kind of establish what I do now as an artist. An early project from after I finished my master's, after a visit to the city of Derry, the walled city, the city of the plantation, I made this painting called Siege. And I was very much looking at what was going on around me. I wanted to make work that was about my lived experience and the society and culture in which I grew up, and was trying to figure out who I was and what I was going to be doing as an artist. So much of what I've done has resulted from conversations. Art's like a way of opening doors and windows, airing out old problems and looking at possibilities. This was the result of a conversation and the sale of a painting to a police officer from Portadown, a detective who was interested in painting. Gave me access to this AK-47 that had been in use in the streets in Belfast, and I cast it in chocolate. In fact, I showed it here at the ICA in a solo exhibition a number of years ago. It was very interesting because it was totally it was a very different interpretation wherever I showed it. Some people smelt chocolate, other people looked at the serial number. I kept coming across artifacts and elements and things that kind of triggered stories and memories. This is the jacket, the kind of Parker jacket, the required uniform of all those that were kind of wanting to change society in the 70s. This was the jacket that Maria Farrell wore in Armagh Women's Prison. And I painted it like a haunting, like a kind of an empty, haunted jacket. And Paul Muldoon wrote a very interesting poem in connection with this about the disappearance of Captain Nairak on the border. But just trying to kind of suggest that we all need to kind of decide which way these things fall in history. I actively campaigned for the Yes campaign, for people to sign that Good Friday Agreement in a positive way. And this was my contribution to the campaign for Yes, which was a few lines of Louis MacNeice, kind of floated out towards East Belfast in an effort to kind of reassure them that Ulster would survive, we would still kind of find a future, and in fact this may well be a better way to live. Unfortunately, the man who kept the weir gates on the Lagan discovered that this was not supported by the DUP and allowed the tide to take it out into the harbour very fast. Another conversation where I had an idea as they were taking the watchtowers down, I approached the Northern Ireland office, writing up an idea that we should actually take one of the watchtowers on the border and transform it into an artwork. The ancient passageway into Ulster along the Belfast-Dublin road. The Cooley Mountains are on one side, and the watchtower Fochalitra, which is the local name, or Gulf 2, which is the Ministry of Defence name. Next thing, I got a phone call from Colonel Wayne Harbour, who was ever so chipper and flew me down to the watchtower in a helicopter. Not a journey that I ever would have anticipated having over South Armagh. But when I got into the watchtower, this is the view of the Cooley Mountains. And I don't know if you can see the word South written above the window, but it was probably to reassure a 17-year-old squatty from Birmingham which direction to look. I made a series of paintings of those watchtowers. We almost instigated, well, we managed to get Bertie Ahern and the Department of Foreign Affairs in the South to put $3.5 million up for a peace monument on the border and an international art competition. But the Celtic Tiger died on its feet, and it didn't seem like such a good idea. It probably would have ended in tears anyway, because they weren't using the original site that we had kind of hoped for, but a bit of waste ground down near your interpretive centre. Anyway, ideas and kind of boundaries and borders are something that really interests me. The idea of being a colonised people and how limited our creativity can be through that colonisation, the possibilities of what we can dream of somehow have a glass ceiling. In 2008, I suggested we towed an iceberg to Belfast as opposed to rebuilding the Titanic. And I genuinely felt that it was an important symbol. The frozenness is like the deepest descent into Dante's hell. All of the trauma and the kind of the necessary recovery that we're still struggling with, for me, was represented in that iceberg. It also was the 100th anniversary of the building of Titanic, and it connected up Belfast, Northern Ireland, to a sense of the global conversation. I was very pleased to see Olaf Eriksson bring an iceberg to Paris, which I think was one of your most successful public art projects. I got a response in Belfast. What would we have left? What would we get for our money? Should there be nothing left? It would melt. So it's very good that Paris is a positive, forward-thinking, creative city, and I hope maybe we should take inspiration from it. In 2013, I was commissioned to do a project in Derry for the Capital of Culture. I reinvented a shirt factory. I employed 6 women. I wanted this to be a really kind of deeply engaged project, rather than just kind of skimming on the surface of something. I knew the history. I'm fascinated by history and human stories. Basically, we created a museum and a working shirt factory. And we started to make things. The women sewed things that I designed. This is an image of the very first civil rights march. And we used the back of a man's shirt. We recycled shirts and made them into kind of civil rights march cushions. Because going on a civil rights march meant you had to leave the comfort of your sofa and get out in the street. And when Ivan Cooper came in one day, he told me he was a manager of a shirt factory. He was also one of the foremost members of the civil rights movement. And he said if it wasn't for the women in the shirt factories coming out when he called, going on strike, putting pressure on the kind of the business people of the city, they wouldn't have been able to make the headway that they made. And I have to say that the city was built on the labour of women in that shirt factory, or in all of those shirt factories. There isn't a single monument, there isn't a single image, there isn't a single sculpture to mark that, that female narrative in history. I started creating specialised products. Because Derry was a walled city, they actually were under siege at one stage, so food was scarce. I made a honey product called the Bee Specials honey, and the idea was that this was a group of police, a kind of a military wing of the Northern Ireland government that were hated by a lot of people, but were loved by individuals who were connected to them. So I was trying to kind of release us from that toxic, distasteful history and to allow people to move into the future. It was quite a sweet project. This is a dangerous drugs cabinet filled with other things that I figured were relevant. I've Podrick Pierce pasta sauce, the red ham of Ulster, dry your eyes tissues, and some bridge over the Troubles water. So I was kind of starting to play with things that I had in the larder, things that everybody was seeing and using every day. Ulster vinegar was bitter to the last drop, and trying to use humour as a way of kind of creating a little bit of confusion. When you have people laughing, you can kind of dodge them into thinking other things. And we tend to laugh at things that make us nervous or that seem ironic or things that even frighten us. Anyway, that cabinet ended up, and a lot of the products from the shirt factory ended up over at the Turner Prize. We were invited by Penelope Curtis to provide the visitors shop at the Turner Prize, which was kind of nice. This is an Easter egg, a decorated Easter egg with a little kind of cigarette paper com echoing the messages brought in and out of H-Block. And in 2016, I was commissioned by the Arts Council in Dublin to do a national project inspired by Thomas Clarke's shop, which was a newsagent shop in 1916, the beginning of the rebellion. He was one of the main figures. He sold tobacco and newspapers, but in the back of the shop there were all sorts of other things, mischievous things going on. Now I'm going to show you a short film. Hopefully I haven't taken too long. Just far there, yeah. Okay.
The sprag Iva Hjoppa Tom Clarke am la clia and tally an Thor o vel ferriste Rita Duffy. Chun an theve stig the Hjoppa den Shan Dana of Rahu. In a will fall RET no a yenta, agus lipéid a will shumbal o star politiach than a heiran or her.
I'll speak over this for a moment. We took on a derelict Georgian house in North Great George's Street, which to all intents and purposes felt like it was in 1916. We closed the shutters, you couldn't see the car, or the cars outside. And the house had been used as a tenement, so there were lots of partitions in the ceiling and on the walls. And when I saw those, I knew we were in the right place. I purchased the old shop counter from a little shop in Bonboy in County Cavan and transported it to Dublin. These are some of the products. I'm just conscious that we don't have that much time, but we have Patriot Gargle. We have aprons made for the women that were interned, who fought in the rebellion. And the ICA women, the Irish Country Women's Association, joined in the making of a lot of the products for this installation, which acted as a shop. It functioned as a proper shop. The Free State Jam was made by some of the women from the Irish Country Women's Association, who in some ways are the true army of Ireland. There was a whole series of grave candles. And of course, we had the laundered diesel, which was much more in keeping with the sort of republic that we ended up having. I paralleled the rebellion in Dublin with what was going on in France at the time. My grandfather was killed in the Somme, so I wanted to most of my work has a very personal narrative. So from a Belfast perspective, I was looking at both wars. And I think just to kind of bring you up to date, I'm going to leave this here. The project is actually in Belgium at the moment and opens in Brussels shortly. So if you want to know any more about that, take a trip to Brussels. The project moved, it was here in Paris, and I did another invention in the Mattress Factory Museum in Pittsburgh using the same methodology. For France, I actually made some additional products. These are the Somme sticking plasters with the text that bombs generalize people. And this is a photograph of my grandfather who was killed and is buried somewhere in France. Yeah, I'm gonna hurry along here. This is the kind of Civil Rights March meets the I Have a Dream pillow in Pittsburgh. On to the soft border. I was given the opportunity to make a project with some women in Belcoo and Black Lion. Thanks to European funding, they have a knitting group, which I kind of thought was interesting to have a knitting group on the border, where they, women meet on a Tuesday evening, and I got them to kind of gather up cardigans, jumpers, all sorts of soft fabric, and we recycled them, making them into great big cushions. Traveller women from Cavan made dolls which were similar to the aesthetic in wishing trees and holy well trees, and we ended up basically making the border soft for a period of a couple of weeks in August. And it's very, very much a kind of feminist project coming at things from left field. The idea being that these people were kind of dancing through the sky, and it was very soft and comfortable to lean against the parapet of the wall on the bridge that separates Belcoo and Black Lion. And I discovered that there are these mysterious holes in the dead center of the bridge. I'm not exactly sure what they are or how they came by, but I left it with a view to kind of reinventing those as something kind of special. And that's it. I'm going to hand over to Maria now. Thanks.
Thank you. Just if you wouldn't mind staying with that previous picture for a wee moment, please. So I'm Maria McManus. I'm a poet, and I'm from Enniskillen originally, but I spent, when I was about 10 or 11, my family moved out to within 4 miles of this border. And when I was a teenager, every weekend in life we crossed that border, and every time we walked across that bridge, we would stick our fingers in each of those, 4 in the south and 4 in the north. Right hand in the north, left hand in the south, and that was us officially crossing the border. So it was sorry, I had no idea you were going to show that. So it's incredibly opposite for me to see that, because this is home turf for me. And I was just talking to Declan before we started as part of our preparation for coming in here. And I realized actually that I hadn't written anything until 2001. And Declan said to me, well, did you always write? And I realized that actually I had wanted to write when I was very small. I have a very clear memory of in the house that we lived in, the house my father built. There was a kind of a corridor that went from the hall to the kitchen, with the door open to the dining room, with another door connecting back to the hall. And when I was a child, I used to run around that to the point of hypnosis, almost, with my arms out on either side like an aeroplane, and just running into not thinking at all. But I remember it was on one of those aeroplane trips around the hallway of the house, just stopping still very suddenly, and the thought coming, what do you have to do to be a writer? Because I read all the time, I read everything, and almost as instantly as that thought came, I rationalized it by saying, well, that's not for people like me, because I didn't know anybody who was a writer. And it just, the arts was not something that was a part of our life. I lived in pretty much in a bookless house, with my mother giving out stink, complaining that I would always go to the library after school, always be bringing home books into a house that had 8 children, and these precious things, as far as she was concerned, that belonged to other people, i.e. the public, would get damaged, eaten, torn up, destroyed, lost, and so on. So therefore, I should not be bringing such things home. Anyway, fast forward to 1998, and I think the Good Friday Agreement was something that gave us breathing space, certainly gave me breathing space. I had also the recollection today that when Bloody Sunday happened, which I think it feels very much like it was a major significant event triggering much of what came afterwards, I was 7. By the time the 1998 agreement came around, my younger child was 7. By the time I had my first child, she was 2.5 weeks old, and it was my younger brother's 21st birthday, and the Enniskillen bomb happened. And into that, our immediate neighbours that we'd grown up beside when we were children died. And to find myself in a situation with a brand new baby, I was 22, with this little child, my younger brother's 21st birthday, and being overwhelmed with not having a language for what had happened, and also being overwhelmed by thinking, what have I done to bring a child into this? Only to bring another child into it several years later. So I think that also shaped me in that I went into emergency mode, that the priority was to hold down a job, to provide for my children, to keep them safe, to put all of my energy into that. And so with the agreement came a lifting a lid on energy and space and imaginative space. And then in 2001, coincidentally, I had booked to go for the very first time to a writer's weekend on another island, not the island I was born on in Enniskillen, but Rathlin Island, which is our only inhabited offshore island in the north, for a writer's weekend with a friend on the basis of saying nobody will know that we don't write, so we can just go and pretend that we do, and nobody will be any the wiser. And what had happened was that 9/11 happened a couple of days before that. So we arrived on this island into beautiful sunlight with British Army ships on manoeuvres up and down the far side of the island. The world changed forever. And what happened for me was that on the Sunday, the final day of that weekend away, an artist, a sculptor Paddy Burns, you know Paddy, gave a lecture called How Does an Island Dream? And I was as far away from him in that space as it was possible for anybody to be, diagonally opposite him in the room. And he said in his talk, I believe that art can save the world. And the experience for me was to feel that physically as a thump into the solar plexus, and a physical reaction to it throughout my body, which I didn't really understand. But it really was pivotal in changing the direction of my life, and poetry is where I landed, which seemed a bizarre place, well, for me, coming from someone who had avoided a literary life, really, who had disenfranchised myself from it, basically from about the age of 15. I went into survival mode. What does it take to get through the school? What does it take to get a job? What do I have to do to mind these children? What do I have to do to build a career? What do I do to get money, etc., etc. Until you get to the point where you think, actually, I cannot continue to live like this, and I won't do it to myself. But by the time I got to that, which was about 2011, between June of 2011 and April of 2012, I walked out of a marriage. I walked out of the family home. My children were reared and were gone to university anyway. And in 2012, I jacked in my job and thought, right, that's it. Wherever this is taking me now, I go. I know what I'm walking away from. I don't know what I'm walking into. And if you wouldn't mind bringing up the little pictures. Thank you. So here I am, sort of 17 years on from that. Poet, playwright, 3 collections published, a pamphlet, have written and worked with most of the major theatre companies in the north. But actually what I'm really passionate about is about poetry and literature in public space, and making an intervention in public discourse, and particularly in the north. So this is the Poetry Jukebox. It's one of a number of projects I feel very concerned about. The graffiti on the walls that we experience in Belfast is racist, sectarian, anti-gay, it's anti-women, it's all of these things. And actually we have 2 life-affirming pieces of graffiti in the city. One on the gable end wall of a house, or of an area that I used to live in that faces the river, and it says, "What does quantum gravity have to tell us about the origins of the universe?" And the second one was a quote from a punk song by the Undertones called, and the quote was, "Teenage kicks so hard to beat." And that piece at the instruction of politicians in advance of the G8 summit in the north, was painted out, painted over, because it was viewed to be unsightly, which is a bizarre decision in a city that has every form of offensive graffiti on the walls, including enormous walls that have gotten higher and wider and longer since the peace process. So Poetry Jukebox is a way of animating public space by amplifying quiet voices and putting poetry into public space. And then another little project that I work on is called Label Lit. And Label Lit is a way of collaborating actually with other poets and other writers to put micro poems or meaningful fragments of other poems onto luggage labels and distributing them in public spaces for members of the public to find serendipitously, and then we see what happens after that. So, for example, on Poetry Day this year, I have more than 60 poets with 20 labels each. The project is called Take Me Home 1,000 Times. Most of those poets are in Ireland, North and South. Others are in England, Wales, Spain, Portugal, the US, Australia. And on the day, some of the people are travelling, so between Sydney and Galway, between London and Ballyclare, from Ballina and London and Stonehenge and so on, and making a little trail of these luggage labels across the country. And the third project that I'm working on is one that Declan and I have worked on before, is exporters, so facilitating. This is the second cohort, and I have a group of 20 writers in this cohort, again recruited from the north, from the south, and the third section of that is to really work with the optimum diversity, is recruited from people who have come to make Ireland, North or South, their home. And again, all of those writers engaged in an intensive process specifically about interrogating borders of all sorts, whether they are physical and geographical borders, like the one that is our border, intrapersonal borders, interpersonal borders, borders of sexuality, experience, life, death, all of these kind of themes emerging. And I think I'll just wrap up my input by reading something for you. And will you hold that for me, Declan, because I can't do the two things. I'm going to read a poem called Despair. Despair is shoeless, homeless, hungry, angry. It falls exhausted and staggering. It is cold, thirsty, is poison in the water, is hoarding, is filth and prison, is torture, is violence and rage, is hatred, is obedience, is laws that lip sync, making rules for silence. It trades truth for glamour, cowardice, hygiene, and wars without a single body bag. It is cold. So cold, all feeling ceases. And I'll read just one more, which is the final poem in the book. And this is called Fear. Make a cup for fear. Collect your tears and all the cruel rain and some night, when the earth is at its darkest, those days of absent moon. Put the cup out in the open, overnight, underneath the stars. In the morning, run your fingers across the flowers of its prayers and drink from it. A salve for the pain, something for the cure. Repeat as necessary, then go on.
Thank you, Maria. Okay, so Emmanuel, you'd like to say something now? Okay.
Well, I'm going and try and give my own little testimony. As everybody understands, I'm the foreigner on this stage. I'm the outsider on this stage. Sorry. Thank you for allowing me to be. A few things I want to say is that listening to you, I realize, and probably everybody realizes how great it is to listen to you. Every time I travel and do a story like this, I think I have the best job in the world because I get to meet great people like you. I go into your house. I know Rita's house. I spend almost a day with you, a wonderful day with you in Belfast. So thank you for that. Thank you for Nora and Rosetta for the great connections you made. That's actually the good part of the job, is meeting people and trying to write it to French people. So I write for Télérama, a magazine which is called Télérama. I've been with them for 18 years. Before that, I was a music critic for Les Inrecuptibles. So my relation to Ireland was mostly through music. And this was new to me. The whole political situation, the social situation was new. But I want to say this, as a 15-year-old kid, I was a fan of U2 at the time, not U2 now, but U2 at the time. I really loved their record called October. There was Boy and October. Boy was a wonderful record. And obviously I was 15, 1982, Sunday Bloody Sunday. That, I don't know if people shared that experience, but it was a huge hit here in schools, in colleges, and we were all fans of U2 and Ultravox and Depeche Mode. And that song, was, I don't know what to say about Bono today, but at the time, that song opened eyes to my generation in France. And I always wanted to go to Derry, so I knew of the Bogside, Bloody Sunday. I always made the promise to go to Derry and Belfast. I wanted to see those places. So that was my first experience. And then I went to Ireland, did all the interview, the Pogues, Divine Comedy, all of them, almost for 20 years. That was my job. And I never really looked more inside the history of Ireland and inside what's called the Troubles. You said yesterday, Declan, that it's called the Troubles, but it's more than that. It's a conflict. So I kind of avoided it, and this time I could not avoid it because Brexit brought it back to our face. So I said, okay, I'm going to go to Ireland. We met, we discussed the subject, and I spent this wonderful time with you. That's the good part. The bad part, and that story was very hard. The bad part is all the research. I had never really realized how complicated and complex everything is. The history of Ireland, I don't know if you've tried to read a book on the history of Ireland, it's about that thick. There's a battle every 2 years, and it's very complicated. I think France is a very easy country to understand compared to Ireland, seriously. The geography, you showed a map earlier. That border was never meant to be a border between Europe and outside Europe. It's counties borders. It's so complicated. On the trip, I was on my car. It's one of those trips you forget about the GPS. The GPS will take you nowhere. The GPS will take you into a field. So you go back to an old paper map and you say, where do I go now? Right, left, where is the border? The border disappears. There's this thing called the polyp. You know that? You had it on the map. Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned it as the polyp. I'd never heard of a polyp on a frontier, and it's just so weird. So the geography is weird, the history is weird. So I had to read all those books. It's good that there's a brilliant library at the Centre Culturel, so I borrowed the books. This is about 3-4 weeks of getting ready for the trip. And then the trip. And the big surprise there was how personal it's for all of you. Every one of you on this stage, you have lost someone, or if not in your family, your neighbors. I had no idea of that. I had no idea of the extent. It's over 3,500 people killed, but it's in 30 years, but it's more than 10,000 people injured. It's more than 10,000 bombings, attacks, counterattacks, revenge, traps, more than 10,000. It's more than 2-3 a week. It's about 2 or 3 per week for 30 years. I had no idea that it was all that bad and all that personal for you. So the work was very emotional. I spent great time with you, John. I found John to be very witty, very funny. You all laughed at John's stuff. But if you laugh, I think if you laugh at John's stuff, it's because it's tragic. It's the tragic and the stupidity of it all that makes us laugh. So John was exactly like that for the whole day we spent together. He was very witty, very fun, very funny, but he was also tense. With Rita was the next day was another experience. Rita was very warm, very... I think the Soft Border project represents you very much, but she was also very intense too, very intellectual and stuff. Then I went to Belfast. The next day I moved to Derry. These people are not here tonight, but I met great people in Derry. The Theatre of Witness. What's the name? The Playhouse? Is that the name? Yeah. It's a wonderful thing, the Theatre of Witness. That was very moving for me to meet these people. And then I drove to Belfast. And that's another story because it's not technically on the border, so I just published that yesterday on the Télérama website. And with you, we did something else. We did the murals. We took your car and you took me to all those murals. The day before, I had seen the Boxside. I seen the murals in the Boxside. I'm sure most of you know those places. And I thought, well, I underestimated it, the size of it, the number of the walls, the level of hatred on those walls. I was in a shock because it's Kalashnikov everywhere and I hate you, no, I hate you more than I hate you. Then the flags everywhere, they have little flags everywhere, but then the kids cut the flags. Do you remember we did those pictures together? So you go to the Shankill and they have Union flags, but some Catholic kids at night go and découper, how do you say that? Cut it with cutters. So a flag in itself to me is pretty sad. I don't like flags, but a destroyed flag. How depressing is that? And so remember we had that conversation, and I told you it's too much. Those walls, you know, it's just too much. So just to finish and pass la parole à mon compère de droite. It's hard for me the English sometimes. When I got back, so the good part is being there. It's hard sometimes to do the research. And the worst part was to write it. When I got back, I decided to leave a lot of stuff out. They all had terribly violent testimonies to bring to me. All of them have told me I was there. John was in a shooting once in a cemetery. You lost very close, all of you. So I had to make the choice to keep that of the article, because I said if I write every ugly thing they have told me, my article is going to be so depressing, nobody will want to read it. Just, you know, I was like, phew. And so it took me about 2 weeks to write it, and I will finish with this for now, just to tell you that at the end I was sick of it. I was seriously sick of it. It's one of the hardest articles I've ever had to make, and it's a very complex thing because, like everybody, I feel the Irish people to be very welcoming, very warm. You are wonderful people, not quite as good as the French, but close. You're wonderful, but I think, and Maria told me that, I think you're also still today traumatized. I think there's trauma in all of you, and rather than a question, I will just give my little testimony and a message. It's to keep going exactly what you're doing. I think it's through the arts, through beauty, through poetry, that you can help your country and your own people to move forward. I think Ireland has got to move forward. It's a shame that the Brexit brings you, in a way, Brexit takes you 20 years back, in a way. And it's not you, it's the English that impose that on you, so it's very silly. But you, as artists, you do exactly the right thing, is to déminer, make it like diffuse, yeah. And you bring humor and you breathe sweetness, and so congratulations for doing what you do, and I hope your work gets seen and spread, and you have to keep and spread the word, and maybe one day get rid of those ugly murals and keep moving and look to the future. That's my testimony.
I suppose I have been a migrant worker for the last 20 years, in that I'm a musician, and I think I have actually tried to ignore borders, actually. For me, part of the amazing thing about the arts is that they transcend where we come from. When I think about music, it transcends so many barriers, so many borders, because it is something more precious, something more incredible than where we come from, or whatever our background is. So I think over the last 20 years, I have deliberately tried to ignore borders, actually. Why am I here? Speaking about this. In fact, here I am in Paris, coming from the north of Ireland, Northern Ireland, because of music. So I love the fact that art is able to go across walls and under walls, or whatever way, that it is greater than walls, I guess. In saying that, because of tonight, I've been thinking about borders more than I normally do, and I was thinking of the whole thing of identity and what it means to me to be from Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland, whatever. And Sigur Rós, this amazing Icelandic band, were asked once, do they think that the music they made has been influenced by the landscape, or by where they come from? And they said they probably would have made a very different record if they'd been born in Jamaica. So there is something about the landscape, the place that we come from, that creates part of our own story, I think, and that's something I'm very interested in, is the stories as human beings that we have to tell. And it's not that all those stories are the same. We all have different landscapes, outside and inside, things, different experiences, different families, different landmarks in our lives. So there's something important about those stories, and maybe it's interesting, Northern Ireland is a strange place, and you find this. It's difficult to understand coming from outside. It's even more difficult to understand if you come from there, I think. But it's and I feel a mixture of being Irish and of being connected to Britain and Britishness. It is this unusual hybrid that nevertheless informs or tells part of my story. So I've been thinking about that. I was speaking to a friend earlier today. I won't lie and pretend that I've known this for a long time. I only found this out today because of tonight. And he told me that the Irish word for border actually means, the translation back into English, it means limitation, which I think is really interesting. That is one way of seeing a border, is just this limitation. And so all I'm doing is telling you what I'm thinking about. At the moment, I don't have answers. So I've been thinking about the border as a limitation to what we can achieve, to who we want to be, to the story as it ends currently at chapter whatever. So in some ways I absolutely resent borders, because of that limitation, I think. I think that's all I want to say at the minute, so thank you all.
Thanks to each of you for those really considered and varied responses. And I won't say much now because I'd like to give everyone in the room a chance to be able to respond too, but just to pick up on a number of the things, perhaps to remind ourselves of some of the themes which have thus far emerged. I took note, I think, of the importance in John's presentation and also in Rita's too, of the importance of a kind of acknowledgement of absurdity and also an artistic process of intensification and exaggeration ad infinitum of some of that absurdity, which has a great ironic, satirical, critical value. And in addition to that, thinking about exaggeration as we see it in Rita's and absurdity also in Rita's and John's, this raises for me the question of what is art doing, or what indeed can art do in these circumstances. And this is something which came up, of course, in the moment told to us by Maria of that revelatory, punch to the solar plexus of someone declaring that art can save the world. And not always, all the time, do we feel sure of that possibility, but maybe to hear it held out as a possibility could be liberating and revelatory. The other thing that I thought when Maria was talking was about the way in which certain kinds of things might compel us towards acts of artistic response, that there might be moments of such extremity and difficulty and trauma that some other means of engaging with the world suddenly becomes necessary. And that perhaps means, like Peter is saying, about some limitation, some limit has been crossed or has to be crossed. I'm reminded of a definition of poetry given in passing by Seamus Heaney. He does this brilliantly in his writing, where he'll just almost in brackets, he'll give you the best definition of poetry ever. But he says at one point that poetry might be thought of as an extension and refinement of the mind's most extreme recognitions and language's most unexpected apprehensions. But that notion that poetry might be about extreme recognitions as well as these novel apprehensions. But so something in it is extreme, something in what you guys have said about your work is extreme in its absurdity. But we're maybe compelled into an understanding of that extremity. The two other things which I thought were really important to mention here were Emmanuel's wonderful way of coming at this situation is about the encounter, the importance and the revelatory discovery of encountering difference, encountering specificity, what artists do in particular. What makes what they do different from what we ordinarily encounter, what we ordinarily read about in news reports or hear in the form of cliches, and that specificity, developed through conversation and travel and time spent with people seems so important. But perhaps the last thing that in summing up that I wanted to take note of is Peter's really lovely notion of having ignored the border. And that's not, I think, obliviousness or detachment. That's a different way of being, really. And in fact, an awful lot of great radical acts in history have been done with people acting as if the problem that was there did not exist, So almost when Rosa Parks decides to sit down in the bus, she acts as if she's allowed to do that, And, one of the things the Good Friday Agreement did was it allowed everyone almost to act as if, there is no border. Because the Good Friday Agreement tied into it the idea that you could be British or Irish or, amazingly, both, which is a very strange thing, that your identity is not attached to a territory. It's attached to a possibility of, belief. So the idea of ignoring the border seems to me a delightful one, but also a kind of, an important, radically demanding idea.
Can I make a little comment on that?
You can, of course, and we'll open that right up.
Yes, and then we'll take questions. But I totally agree with you, but the way I felt it when I was there, that the border was almost not there anymore. I remember being in the car with Rita, and I was driving then. Oh, no, I was driving. And I said, where is the border? And she said, well, we just passed it, didn't you see? Oh, okay. That's where the big fireworks shops were, the change money was. And then you explained me that you had two wallets, two of course, pounds and euros.
On a good day, I have two wallets.
Yes. And yes. And one in euro, one in pounds, two credit cards because you've got two accounts. And I said, oh, really? That must be annoying. I said, well, but it's okay. So in a way, the border, for you border people, I realized there was a borderland, there was a border spirit. You live that far from the border. You pass the border 10 times a day, you don't even realize anymore. So in a way, that specific border, you're talking about artistic borders, philosophical border, but that material border was gone. So that's why I find it so silly that people from outside, some Boris Johnson and other people like that, are bringing. I hope it won't happen, it would be a soft border. But there was, when I was there in December, there was this huge risk of reinstalling a border that was gone. It's the stupidity of this thing. That's all I wanted to say. Yeah.
It's a massively wasteful, destructive, retrogressive thing. When I think of all the funding that the EEC has provided to assist, to heal, to deal with trauma, to build infrastructure, to help communities knit themselves together after 30 years of violence. It's like some decree from Westminster is coming down upon us, where they really haven't given it a second thought. And I just think that someday, fairly soon, I'm going to wake up and discover that it's all been a bad dream and that they have kind of pushed back that right-wing wave that seems to be coming from America, washing over Britain and kind of flooding on in through Europe. And unless we actually come to grips with the fact that we need to be dismantling borders and allowing human beings that are right now hanging on by their fingernails in huge refugee camps in this country and in other countries across Europe, we need to find ways of sharing what we have. Otherwise, this planet is not going to be livable.
And Rita, and perhaps everyone else, I mean, you've already spoken about this to some extent, but right now, I mean, we talked about the ways in which people have worked as artists over the years and developed practices and so on. But with the things in mind that you've just mentioned, with these new pressures and new constraints, what are the types of things, like John, if you're thinking about the border again?
I'm thinking about the border right now.
I know you are.
Always thinking about the border.
I could see, you had that
see
look.
it in my eyes, yeah.
Yeah.
The border.
But what is it, with all the things that Rita's saying, what does it do to your dirty thoughts about the border?
It's a very small little planet we live on in this huge universe. I mean, like, life is short, but I think, because there's huge problems facing us as Europeans, as Irish people, as people, it doesn't mean that everything eclipses the local, or And I suppose what's happening with in Ireland is a microcosm, I suppose, in a way, of this global thing of issue with borders and movement and of people and identity, and I was going to tell a funny story. Well, it's not so much a funny story, but I suppose it's this thing of identity. It's not actually just the line. It's about how we feel about ourselves and how important or not important that is. I remember years ago when I lived in London. I lived in London for 9 years, and I remember I was in Shepherd's Bush Green, and there was. I'm probably changing the subject here, but anyway.
That's fine.
I was in Shepherd's Bush Green, and this American came over American tourist, obviously, and he says, "Excuse me, can you tell me how to get to London proper?" And I thought, my God, this is the most London of places. Like, you couldn't get more London than Shepherd's Bush Green. There's the home of the BBC. It's multicultural. There's brilliant markets, bars. This is the 80s, so he was really looking for, I guess, Big Ben so I suppose that thing about people, I suppose growing up we had this idea that where's Ireland proper, or the Simon and Garfunkel song, like going off to look for America, and how much does it matter where we live? But it does, or who we are, but it does. It doesn't, and it does, and that's the dilemma, I think. Does it matter whether I live outside the Irish Republic, or was born and brought up there? Does it matter really?
But can choosing to live somewhere become a radical act? Like for 30 years, 6 miles on the northern side and 6 miles on the southern side of the Irish border was basically no man's land. People lived there because they had been born there or they had land there. What we discovered was that it was one of the last wildernesses left on the island of Ireland, where huge kind of random development all over the south and incredibly beautiful places where people had bought planning permission and corruption had allowed them to kind of do whatever they wanted, discarding the environment, had spoiled enormous places in Ireland, whereas in patches of the border you had representation of 90% of the wildlife on the island, huge forests. I mean, it's quite a beautiful place.
We need more borders in Ireland.
well, maybe we actually need to to kind of use some of that empty space in Ireland to allow people to have good lives there.
Maria, that place, that salient I was talking about in between Fermanagh and, I mean and there's an echo here really of the Brexit thing, because in the early 20s there was a thing called and I'm going back in time now, the Boundary Commission. The border as it is now was at that point was a provisional entity, and it was supposed to be adjusted by this body called the Boundary Commission, which would have probably straightened out the line, that odd salient, but in 1925 the then Taoiseach of the Republic made a deal in that the Republic was excused of its debt for the First World War as a former part of the United Kingdom. So Ireland was forgiven its 1.5 million debt to live with this provisional line that remains today. So I just discovered that recently, actually. So I thought that was a bit like that kind of Brexit payoff thing, or you can go, but so. Anyway, I'll let somebody else talk, because
I think there's a couple of things that strike me. Is that we also need to be aware that in the 20 years that we've had since the Good Friday Agreement, we've had more people in the North die by suicide than we had who died in the conflict. It's a really, really serious issue for us to consider. What is that about? Why is that happening? This is a really serious crisis for us, and it tells us something is really seriously not well, that we have such an issue with people killing themselves. The other thing that I think it needs to sit alongside this is we could make ourselves, and I don't mean this in any contemptuous way, but so special that we get mired about what has happened without thinking, how is it that we put that to work now for the good of everybody? And I mean for the good of all of us. What have we learned from this experience? And what does that teach us that is of use to the world in terms of putting that to work for the people who have come to live amongst us? And those people who were here last night will know that one of the points we were discussing was that the people who came to live amongst us before the Troubles ended were either British soldiers or elite groups such as academics or doctors or those kind of people who came from elsewhere to get experience or to work in the universities or in the hospitals and so on. The people who come to live amongst us now are seriously traumatized, often very impoverished people. They are coming from Somalia, from Sudan, from Syria. And they're displaced also from where it is that they came from, and they bring all of that trauma with them into a society that is still bruising easily, still hypersensitive and not necessarily in a healthy way. And a society where a dramatic number of particularly our young men, but on the other hand, our old people are actually killing themselves. And I don't have the answers to that, but I'm kind of conscious that it's there on there. It's there. And we are a population of 1.7 or 1.75 million people.
Peter, just before we go maybe to the audience for some questions, what Maria is talking about there is in part about the transformations in the population and in part about the legacies of the conflict and a society which remains wounded and challenged by what happened there. I just wonder, is there anything about songwriting and music in that regard that, you know, that connects with those topics for you, whether it's about the transformation in the place or the, you know, the longer term impact of what's happened there?
For me, I've always written about politics with a small p, politics of the heart. That is about how I relate to other people, and you know, some of that in the cliched love kind of ways, and other ways just with how I kind of am a human being. When Maria was talking there, I was realizing, you know, how unbelievably provincial we are in the sense that I guess I was thinking about France and about Paris and the diversity of people that who live here, and you know, we have so much to learn in Ireland about how to, you know, here we are, two essential tribes, kind of still battling it out, and yet across the world there is so much more diversity in different countries and cities. So I think, I don't know, I feel very humbled being here and talking about this, because I just think we, as a nation in Ireland as a whole, we have so much to learn about how to get on with people, and I think just listening more to people who've been through things is what we need to do.
No.
There's one very last comment I want to make that's going to be very short.
Very short, and then we'll
yeah,
take
it's
some
just
questions.
because they're not here tonight, but what I remember most from the people in Derry. So in Derry, I met two people, a woman and a man. She had been with the IRA when she was very young, not putting bombs or anything, but she was like making the bombs. And he had been a terrorist too, but on the loyalist side. And they both said exactly what Maria said. They said, we have a problem with suicide, we have a problem with depression, and they said we must beware of the youth. There's a problem with the youth. There's a problem of kids who are now 15, 16, 17 on both sides, who are some of them ready to go for the fight again. They just because life is depressing for them, because since they were 3 or 4, they've seen the murals, so Bobby Sands on one side and British commandos on the other side, and that's all they've seen. So I think there's also an issue with education.
All there is left to do right now is thank everybody involved, and that is, of course, everybody here who's been speaking on the panel, but also Nora from the Centre Culturel Irlandais, and her team here who've been incredibly helpful and supportive. And of course, all of you for coming and listening and talking this evening. So thank you. And